Okay, basically there's 4 ways to apply paint to paper. And I'm going to take this sheet. This is just a basic type of paper. It's not real expensive, actually. It's kind of cheap, but it's okay to practice on. And this, I'm going to divide this in 4 areas. And this area up here is, I'm going to put WW, stands for wet into wet. And then we've got W, wet on dry. And I have dry on dry and dry on wet. So what this means is on this particular rectangle, my paper's going to be wet. So I'm going to go ahead and wet that with water. I'm going to use the largest brush I have because I want to cover quite a big surface. And I certainly wouldn't use my little brush for that. I use the big one. I usually go this way and then across. And that way I'm sure I've got everything wet. Because if you miss a spot, the paint won't go over it. And it's going to make it not what you want. Okay, now I'm going to mix up paint. Any color, actually, I'm going to use what's in my palette here. I think there's some cadmium red in there. But what I'm trying to do is to make kind of a weak color. So there's more water than pigment in this particular mixture. And what I'm going to do with that is show you, we consider that, for lack of a better term, wet paint. So I've got wet paint, which is thin and watery, and I'm putting it on wet paper. And look what that does. That just keeps bleeding out. It acts like a paper towel. It just keeps sucking it up. And something to keep in mind with watercolor, as it dries, it's lighter. So if you like what color you put down, you're not going to be happy with it when it's dry because it's going to be about 30% lighter. And you can tell there's a good bit of water on this page. I can move that around. And look at that, it's almost disappearing. It's so light. So now I'm going to take the same consistency of paint, but I'm going to apply it on dry paper. Now you can see those edges. All those edges are very soft. The same consistency of paint as I used there, but on dry paper. And look at the difference. Color's about the same, and granted, by the time the paper absorbs it, it's going to look lighter. But see the edges? I can control my edges so much better than I could up here. Even at this point, I can lay some down and it'll still just keep going. Here, I can do the same thing, but it's going to stay put. So there's the difference, and you're saying, why would I do that? Well, you want something soft where the edges disappear. You want to make sure that it's on wet paper or damp paper. Here, if I want something that disappears or blends, I'm never going to be able to get that on dry paper because it'll just stay right where I put it. Now, let's move on to the third way. Now, I'm going to mix up some more paint. This is, I'm using cadmium red. Not that you have to. I just like to always say what paint I'm using because it helps us get to the point where we can identify a little bit easier. And I'm mixing more pigment than water. I want this pretty thick. And you can see, like, to demo here, take my finger and go up through here, it will stay separated. Had that been thinner, it just would have filled back in. So put a little bit more in here. So less water, more paint. Now, I'm going to wet, I'll use even a bigger brush here. I'm going to do this one down here with the wet paper. And that D that's on here stands for dry, meaning it's drier than the wet mixture that we put on. So obviously less water, more pigment. So here the paper's wet. My paint is much more concentrated, less water, more pigment, and we're comparing these two. Look how that just explodes, where it's just pulling that out. Now I am going to have much richer color left in this, but also because my pages, my area is wet, I can move this around. It'll just keep going. It's also a nice time if you want to blend some other color in there. Or actually, this is what they call charging paint in. It's wet, so I can bring this, add a little bit of blue in there, and it will blend with that. And I'm always going to have soft edges, no matter if it's thick paint or thin paint, watery paint or not watery paint. The edges are always going to be soft. Okay, now on dry paper, the dry paint, the really thick paint. There it is. Isn't that beautiful? It's going to stay right where I put it. The edges are all very defined. We call those hard edges. It's just going to stay right there. And that's the difference of the 4 ways that you can actually put paint to paper. Now, we mix these, we do variations, but that's basic. And once you start to understand that, it'll help you to advance in your watercolor.